3 talks, and we've asked each of the people not so much to give a kind of review of the book, but to sort of bounce off the book. And I'll just introduce them all now. The first will be Jonardon Ganeri, whose talk is called Our Talk of the Merely Intentional on Tzohar's Analysis of Buddhist Upacāra. And then Catherine Pewitt on How to Bring Words to Life, Apoha as the Transition Between Non-Conceptual and Conceptual Language in the Pratyabhijna Shaivism. And then Evan Thompson, Metaphors and Realities. And Evan is from UBC, Catherine from George Mason University, Jonardon Ganeri, New York University. They've all been here before. They're well known to our community, and it's really delightful to have them all back. So, Jonardon, you're up.
I was thrilled when Bob wrote to me to tell me that Roy had won this award and to invite me to come and join the celebrations. It's the best kind of academic event when you're celebrating somebody's wonderful achievement, and it really is a wonderful book. I really admire Roy's achievement with this book. So I thought that I would talk through some of the themes in the book in my own, think through them in my own way. And hopefully that'll kind of maybe generate some questions for discussion. Now, so the question is how do we use words? How do we use words how do we account for the use of words in all their different aspects? This is Douglas Baker, a famous wrestler. His nickname is the Ox. He's called the Ox. We use the word ox to refer to him. And that's a kind of perfect example of the phenomenon of Upacāra, where you're using a word figuratively to refer to something that's not its literal referent, but in some way related to it. He does look a bit like an ox, I think. We also use the word ox to refer to your actual ox, and both those uses of the word ox are different from using the word ox to refer to this oxman. That's in using the word ox to refer to the oxman. That's another literal use. That's not a figurative use, but a literal use, because somebody who's both an ox and a man. Now, so this is what the topic of Upacāra is all about. As Roy quotes Stiramati, that which is not existent there in the locus of reference is figuratively designated, Upacāryate, like when one calls a Bahika person an ox. Roy's slide was much better than mine, illustrating this. So Upacāra basically is some kind of mechanism of referential transfer or referential substitution when we use a word, when the referent picked out by our use of the word is not its literal referent, but something else. Now, actually, I've been working a lot on Buddhaghosa recently, and I find a very similar discussion of a similar linguistic phenomenon in Buddhaghosa, I mentioned. He says that the agentive construction, the use of the word I, for example, to refer to the agent of actions, is simply an idiomatic way of speaking. He says it's an accessory locution, a sasambhara kata. And his examples are when we say his bow shot him, not me. And what he means, what you mean when you say that is not that the bow shot him, but an arrow from the bow shot him. So the word bow picks out not its literal referent, which is the bow, but rather something related to its literal referent, namely an arrow. Another of his examples is on seeing a visible object with the eye. And Buddhaghosa says that's also an idiomatic way of speaking. What we actually mean is on seeing a visible object with a moment of visual awareness. What actually does the seeing, what's really the agent of seeing is not the eye, but moments of visual awareness. So I've also worked quite a lot on the nature of the self and on first-person reference. So for me, one of the interesting questions is What does this tell us about the way that the first person works in language? What does the word I refer to? It seems that if we want to apply this kind of Upacāra account, what we have to say is that it refers to something which isn't self, but in some way related to the self. We want to say that the word I doesn't designate your actual self, but designates metaphorically or figuratively something related to the self, just as when we use the word ox to refer to Douglas, we're saying it doesn't refer to an actual ox, but something somehow related to an ox, presumably in appearance. And the background problem is that in this account of referential substitution, there is a presupposition that there is a literal referent which isn't present in the given context, and its absence in the present in the given linguistic context is what generates a kind of referential substitution. So the whole account of Upacāra presupposes that there is a literal referent. And clearly that's going to be a problem for Buddhists and Yogacara Buddhists especially. Now, there's a related discussion of linguistic usage in the ancient Indians, and I thought I would just like to mention that briefly. It's of the use of the word ox to refer not to your actual ox, but to a clay ox or a toy ox or to a mechanical ox. And again, we say that's an ox. If you're playing with a child, you say that's an ox, that's a horse, and so on. So we use the word ox to refer to toy oxes, and we can use the word ox to refer to mechanical oxes. And what do all these uses of the term have in common? Why is it that we want an account of the use of the word ox, which can explain all these different ways in which the term is used? Now, some of the ancient Indians did provide exactly that kind of an account. Roy mentions it briefly in passing in his book. The idea is that a word might refer to what the early Nayakas called the akriti, the structural form. So one of the Nyaya Sutras says that a word means a particular structural arrangement and a genus. We might think, so that this suggests a theory of meaning according to which what all these uses of the word ox have in common is that they refer to something which instantiates a certain structural arrangement. So there's like a second order property, a structural arrangement or some other second order property, and the referent of a word is fixed by a rule saying that the word refers to anything which instantiates that structural property. So it refers to a clay ox or to a human who looks like an ox or to a mechanical ox, because they all instantiate the same structure. They all basically have horns, horn-like things and ox-like features. What kind of a theory of meaning would that be? It would be one which is in some ways diametrically opposite to the Yogacara account. Roy calls his Yogacara account a pan-figurative account of meaning, that all words mean figuratively. This would be like a pan-literalist theory of meaning, that every use of the word is literal. The use of the word ox to refer to the wrestler or to refer to a toy ox is a literal use, because what words literally refer to are instantiations of structural properties. And it would be a kind of anti-essentialist theory. There's no essence, underlying essence that all these different objects have in common, right? So it would be an anti-essentialist and pan-literalist theory of meaning, but it would account for all the kinds of problematic usages that motivate the discussion of Upacāra. And isn't that, after all, what's going on in at least some Buddhist accounts of the meaning of the first person and the concept of self, the use of the word self. The very famous discussion of the chariot metaphor in the Milinda Panha seems to be saying that there's nothing more to the designation, a designation like a word chariot, the referent of the word chariot, than a certain structural organization of parts. There's no, essence of a chariot, there's just the structural arrangements of parts. You can make a chariot out of wood or out of metal or out of anything else you like. It's a chariot if it has the right parts and the right combination, and that's all there is. And isn't that the point that's being made about the word self in texts like the Milinda Panha, that it refers just to whatever instantiates a selfie arrangement of skandhas, of mental particulars. If they're arranged in the right kind of way, if they instantiate the right second-order property, then we use the term self to refer to them. It doesn't matter if it's... So it seems like that this pan-literalist theory of meaning does have some Buddhist antecedents. There's a discussion in Shantara Rakshata where he says something along the lines that you can have different herbs which have the same pharmacological property, right? And we use the same word for any of them. So to give a modern example, you might say an analgesic. You can have ibuprofen, you can have paracetamol, you can have aspirin. They're all analgesics, they're all painkillers, even though they've got completely different chemical properties. So we use what fixes the referent of words is some kind of functional property, a second-order property of some sort. So that seems to be an account of meaning that does have Buddhist antecedents, and may even be what motivates some accounts of apoha. I can't nice to talk about that. Now, so why is it then that the Yogacara Buddhists that Roy is talking about go in a completely different direction? Their motivation seems to be a quite different one from this kind of pan-literalism. And it's all to do with their obsessive interest in mental representation, as Roy has talked about. They're interested in what it is about how it is that a mental representation comes to have an object. There's this famous painting by Magritte that you all must know. I think it was here recently. It was in San Francisco recently, as far as I understand. He says it's not a pipe. This is your actual pipe, and this is not a pipe. It's not a pipe, of course, because it's a picture of a pipe. There's no actual pipe there at all. All you've got is a representation of a pipe. And so in this key passage from Stiramati, which I think Roy put up on one of his slides too, he's commenting on the verse in Vasubandhu's Trimshika. The metaphor, and it uses the term upacara, which Roy translates as metaphor. The metaphor of things such as matter, and the metaphor of self, and so on, having its base in the appearance of matter and in the appearance of self, which due to a mental construction appear as if they're external, so it's all about appearances and mental representations, occurs from time immemorial even without an external thing, a self or things. Like in the case of the metaphor, upacara, of net-like apparitions experienced by a person suffering from timira, eye disease. Now, this passage puts mental representation and the problem of intentional content firmly on the table, but it's also a bit puzzling. It's also, in the last bit, it's referring to hallucinations, or illusions, optical illusions and hallucinations, and they're also called upacara. And it seems like a bit odd to use the term metaphor to refer to hallucination or an illusion. So indeed, that point has been picked up in a recent review. Oh, sorry, I just have this picture by Hussein. Hussein is a contemporary Indian artist who started life, I think, as a toy maker. So his pictures of oxes have a kind of toy-like quality. So that was very nice. In any case, that slide was misplaced slightly. Keating, in his review, Notre Dame Philosophical Review of Roy's book, picks up on this point and says that we were much better off translating upacara as superimposition. It makes much better sense to say that what's going on is the superimposition. You know, we're superimposing on visual data a certain kind of mental representation. So we superimpose, you know, somebody suffering from an eye disease superimposes a certain representation onto the visual data. So the criticism that Keating is making is that upacara seems to have much more to do with some notion of mental superimposition than being anything specifically linguistic. But I think both of them are right in a way, and I think what we really want is a middle way. That is, what we want is an account that preserves a link between upacara and language, because there clearly is one. And the early chapters in Roy's book all document how this term is used to refer to this mechanism of referential transfer, for example, but also seems to be used in the context of mental representation and the way that we can have an object in mind, the way that the mind represents objects, intentionality. And I think that the way to get that middle way, that kind of joint account, is to think through what it is that makes a hallucination a hallucination of something, what it is that gives hallucinations intentional content, makes them of something. Why is it that a hallucination is of one thing rather than another? If we think through that question, we get to an account of upacara that preserves both of these forces. And I think that's exactly what Roy was after in his own analysis. He says quite clearly at the end of his book, "Let me conclude by stating that I've tried to show that the Yogacara frame of thought described here is founded on a deep structure that reappears in the school's understanding of linguistic meaning and in its account of experience. In all these cases, both agreement and discrepancy," that's the intersubjectivity that he was talking about, "the shared and the private, are explained in causal mental terms, yielding what I've described as a broadly conceived theory of meaning, which is not merely linguistic, but also perceptual." So this kind of account of upacara, according to which upacara is both linguistic and to do with mental representation, is exactly what Roy was after. So let's think a little bit then about the nature of hallucinations and what makes a hallucination of something. There's the famous case that all philosophers love to cite. It's probably the only thing they've ever read, which is the Macbeth. "Is this the dagger which I see before me, or a fatal vision proceeding from a heat-oppressed brain?" In other words, he's asking the question, is it just a kind of a disturbance in the causal processes of the brain, in the causal mechanisms of the brain, or is it of something? Is it of a dagger? You know, is it a dagger that I'm hallucinating, or is it just a kind of a disruption in the causal brain mechanisms? Now, I find the most helpful analysis of the objects of hallucination to be from Mark Johnson. He has a very famous paper on this topic, and he also returns to the topic in his most recent book from 2009. And Mark Johnson makes a fundamental distinction between primary and secondary objects of hallucination. Let me talk you through what he says about this. He says, "The primary objects are what I style sensible profiles or structures of qualities, structures that determine the qualitative character of the hallucination." So it's the sensible profile. It's like, you know, qualitative structure of your visual field, or something like that. The secondary objects are the objects determined by how the sensible profile in question strikes the subject, that is, by what the subject immediately takes it to be. So it's what made it the case that it's a hallucination of a dagger is that the subject takes it to be a dagger. It's the subjects taking their visual experience to be of a dagger, which makes it a hallucination of a dagger. So he says, sorry about this long quote, but let me just go through it. To illustrate the use of this terminology, suppose one becomes a connoisseur of one's own drug-induced hallucinations and dwells on their qualities as such. When one simply contemplates one's hallucination, it need not strike one as of this or that particular thing. If in such a contemplative mood, one's hallucination doesn't strike one as of this or of that particular thing, then it won't be of this or that particular thing. So even if I had a visual presentation that was in every way just like that, enjoyed by a hallucinator of a dagger, I might be hallucinating nothing more than a dagger-like array of visible qualities. I would be enjoying this primary object of hallucination, and there would be no secondary object. So you could be having a hallucination and all your attention just focused on the quality of your experience without taking it to be of anything, without taking it to be pointing to anything outside of itself. You're just focusing on the visual experience itself. And that would be the primary object. Johnson goes on, how then are the particular secondary objects of hallucination determined as such? Someone could hallucinate a sensory profile just like the one I hallucinated, and it could strike him or her as a dagger appearing to him. We would then report him or her as hallucinating a dagger, as it were deferring to how things struck him. So he's using this phrase, how things strike me. The person having a hallucinatory experience, there's a way that experience strikes them. And if it strikes them as being of a dagger, then that's a hallucination of a dagger. That's what determines what the object of the hallucination is. What determines that it is a hallucination of a dagger is nothing intrinsic to its appearance or to its sensory qualities, but everything to do with how it strikes the hallucinator. This is Johnson's account. One of the nice things about Johnson's account is that it's neutral on the question about whether the dagger exists or not. It might be the case that I have a hallucination of the Eiffel Tower, and it strikes me that my hallucination is of the Eiffel Tower, so then it's of a real thing, the Eiffel Tower. Or I might have a hallucination of a fantastic beast, and there's nothing in the world that it corresponds to. So it's neutral on the question of the actual existence of the object of hallucination, which I think is important in the Yogacara context because there's a whole debate about whether they're idealists or what the status of the object of mental representation is. So it seems to me that Macbeth's use of the word dagger is an example of Upacāra. The word is used to refer to what Johnson calls the secondary object of hallucination. And if you remember my slide about the pipe, when I say this is a pipe, I point to a painting of a pipe and I say that's a pipe. Then what I'm referring to is the secondary object. I'm referring to the object that's represented in the painting. When Marguerite said it's not a pipe, he's making us refer to the primary object, the surface of paint, the surface of colours on the canvas. So this distinction between reference to a secondary object and secondary to a primary object is illustrated by that Marguerite slide. It's a tangential point, but I think it's an important one, which is that if the object of hallucination is whatever the hallucinator takes it to be, then there can't be any error about it. It can't be the case that the hallucinator takes it to be a hallucination of a dagger, but actually it's a hallucination of a, teacup. That kind of error is impossible because the object precisely is whatever the hallucinator takes it to be. So there's a certain immunity to error. And I mention that because you find a Sangha making exactly that point about immunity to error. He's talking about magicians, which is conjuring up mental images of things, and they can't be mistaken about what it is that they've conjured up an image of, because they themselves determine what it is. All right, so now Roy's pan-figurative hypothesis is that all words are metaphors insofar as their non-existent primary objects are absent from their loci of reference. So a word's actual reference, that which it designates figuratively, is not an object, but rather the entire causal process that makes the object appear in our consciousness, he says. As for the picture of meaning this yields, we may say that if the referent of a word, for instance the word self, is the underlying real ontological causal nexus that brought it about, both the mental appearance of self and its corresponding designation, its sense is roughly the description of this causal process in the Yogacara model of consciousness. So he's saying that for the Yogacarans, all words refer figuratively to the underlying causal nexus that brings the appearance into being, something like that. Now, I was very interested that he used the example of self, because I'm very interested in what the Yogacarans say about the meaning of the word self. Actually, Roy has something else to add to this, another passage. He says, there's a distinction between a fixed reference on the one hand and meaning variance on the other, allows the figurative theory to explain how a simpleton and an advanced bodhisattva can both use the word self with very different meanings, respectively to an essentially existent thing. The ordinary person or the simpleton uses the word self to refer to an actually existing thing, and to a mere mental appearance brought about by a certain activity, and nonetheless be talking about the same thing. Roy went through this in his slides and in his presentation, that the ordinary person and the bodhisattva both use the word self, but the ordinary person suffers under the belief that there is some actual existing thing out there and uses the word in that sense, and the bodhisattva just uses it to refer to mental appearance. I just got a couple more slides to go. If we appeal to Johnson's framework, then we can reformulate that idea as follows. We can say that the meaning of self for an ordinary person is the secondary object of hallucination, like the dagger or whatever, which is taken to be an essentially existent thing. So an ordinary person takes their talk about self to refer to real existent things, whereas the bodhisattva uses the word self just to refer to the sensory profile, just to the mental appearance as such, but without it pointing to anything beyond itself. But Roy said, and this is a question that I want to just leave open, says that they're nevertheless talking about the same thing. And so I just want to know, I'm just not quite sure, what is the fixed reference, the thing about which both the ordinary person and the bodhisattva are talking when in their use of the language of self? There's a primary object and a secondary object. But what is the thing that both are talking about? So that's where I'll conclude. Yeah, thanks a lot.
So I'd just like to echo what everyone has said so far about what an incredible event this is, how incredibly grateful and lucky I feel to be here, because Roy has written a phenomenal book that's really special in a lot of ways. And I agree with everything that Bob said and want to sort of hone in on one point in particular, which is how Roy does such a beautiful job of understanding Yogacara philosophy of language in relation to its full Indian context. And this is something that just like the way that we divide up departments and everything in the academy makes it really hard sometimes to see the full intertraditional dialogues that are happening here and see how sometimes it makes less sense to think that Buddhists are only talking to Buddhists and Brahmanical philosophers are only talking to each other than to really get into the depth of the interrelations in the text. And so I'm going to get even farther to where some of these same kinds of theories went in the centuries following Vasubandhu and Stiramati. I'm going to talk some about how the Pratyabhijna Shaiva tradition, which was a 10th to 11th northern Indian tradition, picked up an enormous amount of the Yogacara epistemology, ontology, along with Dharmakirti's theory of concept formation, the Apoha theory, which was not in Stiramati, but later became really closely associated with Yogacara theories of meanings in really interesting ways. So I'm going to go into all of that, and we're going to see how it goes. So this here is one of the places where Roy is going after one of Asanga's argument against an essentialist theory of reference. In this particular place, he's quoting Tsongkhapa's interpretation of an argument in the Tattva Artha Patalam, and here, Roy is saying that the reason why essentialist theories of references don't work is because, as he says, a relation of correspondence between the designation and the particular object is not the outcome of convention. I.e. is determined in a manner that logically proceeds and is not influenced by any actual language use, and it is grounded somehow in relations between the essential nature and the object. So this is what we don't want. But if this were so, Tsongkhapa explains, the comprehension of meaning would occur without requiring any actual language use, either in thought or speech. And this leads to many absurdities, most notably the rendering of all language use as an outer manifestation of an incommunicable private language, whose semantics is determined prior to and independently of any actual language use. And this definitely seems like it would be a problem, right? Like, this does not sound like we want for our language. It's also really close to what the Pratyabhijna Shaiva theory of meaning is, with one major clarification that gets at the basic question of what language even is. Because the Shaivas would be pretty much down with most of that statement, except that the inner language is non-conceptual, not incommunicable. And so I'm going to get into what that means. I'm going to talk about non-conceptual language and how it is that that allows the Shaivas to combine what is ultimately the Mimamsa essentialist theory of the eternal connection between words and their meanings, and then Dharmakirti's Apoha theory where everything is fully conventional. They use both of them because they're amazing. Okay, so as a little bit of context, the Shaivas use a kind of altered version of Bhartrhari's idea of the levels of Vak. So really complicated stuff that happens in between. But basically the important things for the Shaivas is that Vak, for Bhartrhari, expresses the fact that the fundamental fabric of reality is language. This is the identification between Vak and Brahman that Bhartrhari famously posits. And so Upaladeva, who was the systematizer of the Pratyabhijna tradition, talks about the relationship between language and consciousness in this way. Upaladeva says, consciousness has the nature of realization. This is my translation for Vimarsha, following Ratier, for those of you who would want to know that. It is paravak, which has arisen through its own inclination. Freedom is its primary characteristic. It is the sovereignty of the ultimate self. So what we can see here is that already when we're talking about language in this sense, we're clearly not just talking about sort of articulate sounds that people are making. There's something very different going on here. And the way that difference is articulated is by splitting language, Vak, into 4 different levels. And 2 of these levels are non-conceptual and 2 of them are conceptual. And the difference writ large between all these levels is the nature of the type of differentiation manifest within them. So para, the ultimate, the highest level, is non-conceptual, and at this point, the relationship between a word and its meaning is inherent and eternal. Pashyati is the next level. This is still non-conceptual, but there's sort of what Abhinava refers to as the first stirrings of an internal differentiation. What exactly this level is really complicated, but basically the idea is that you have in ultimate consciousness this sort of infinite capacity for meaningful signification that in Pashyanti begins to sort of unravel itself into a pair, but it's not until the third level, Madhyama, that this actually creates a concept by defining one thing against another. So Madhyama is the level of language where it's an internal discourse that's not yet expressed verbally. It's kind of like mere object discrimination. It's the simple fact that we have a subject-object structured world, and then the bits of meaning that come along with that. And at this level now, word and meaning are distinct. There's no longer an eternal relationship between these things. And then the final level, of course, is our actual everyday articulate verbalized language use. So what we would kind of normally think of as language. So, couple of things here that are pretty interesting. First off, having this structure, you can already see how embedded this is in a pan-Indian discussion that would make no sense whatsoever with reference to only one tradition. Because here we have these Shaivas, and they are using Bhartrhari's theory of the four levels of Vak, and then they're using the Mimamsa theory, actually the eternality of the phonemes, what Roy talked about a lot in terms of this essentialist theory of reference, to account for how it is that at the highest level, language and consciousness and meaning are all identical. And then they have this transition point through Apoha, which is a Buddhist theory, to then account for how it is that conventional meaning could work all in terms of exclusion. So like this sort of in a little ball is the kind of complexity that Roy manages to work so beautifully out in his book by looking seriously at these full intertraditional contexts. But so then the other question that comes up here, so this is a really interesting, hodgepodge of stuff, but is it at all coherent? And actually it is, and metaphor plays a really important role. So one of the clearest points where these Shaivas talk about this transition point, going from ultimate language to conventional language, is in terms of self-awareness, most specifically in terms of something they call the aham prativimarsha, which is the sort of realization I. So this is self-awareness in the sense of being aware specifically, of oneself as a subject, kind of. Except on the ultimate level, this refers to Shiva's own self-awareness. And this is something that is non-conceptual, non-dual, because it is the awareness of consciousness as its full capacity to manifest. And so this is a stage where our normal conventional distinction between subject and object is not present. The conventional one is precisely like my sense of I. And this kind of sense of subjectivity, this realization I, is something that's formed only in relation to others, in relation to an external world, paradigmatically in relation to a body. And so this is something that depends on these kinds of divisions. The way all this works is that we have, so this totality of ultimate consciousness, which is inherently meaningful, which can manifest, which is language, and then what happens is Shiva actually carves away portions of that totality to create these limited conventional realities. And that's where Apoha comes in. I actually haven't said much about Apoha yet. For those of you who aren't familiar with it at all, the basic idea behind it is that concepts don't refer to real things that exist out in the world. They just refer to whatever is left over after we've excluded everything that doesn't fit our interests and desires and stuff like that. So it's not, chair, because there's a universal chairness. These are all chairs because if I want to sit down, I can ignore all the ways that they're different and sit in them successfully. It's the basic idea behind Apoha. And so the thing that the Shaivas run with on this is that you don't have to have a kind of delimited essence for there to be something that can be left over that has meaningful causal specificity. And so if you have this full totality of consciousness, and then you're able to carve away certain pieces of it, then just like how I can get chair, 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 by ignoring the fact that like that chair has a program on it and that one doesn't, and all these other things, by limiting the fullness of consciousness itself, we can end up with these limited worlds structured by subject-object dualities. And that's the transition between ultimate and conventional in terms of self-awareness. And so these are two of the verses where Upaladeva explicitly talks about this. And this first verse is at the beginning of the chapter on Apoha in his Prativijñākarikas. And he says, the realization I, which is the nature of manifestation, prakasha, is not a concept even though its nature is vak, is language. For it, a concept is said to involve a duality and is determinate. So here again we have this idea that language is not exhausted in concepts. That even when we can say that concepts are dualistically formed, that subject-object are the paradigmatic thing that like represents this kind of duality that falsifies our experience of reality, that doesn't mean we have to give up language as an expression of meaning at that point. That there's something else that like further like supports and animates the sort of meaningful use of language. And so then the way that this second verse is about the conventional sense of myself as a subject. And as you can see here, the basic idea is that my sense of myself as a subject is a concept precisely because it has been formed by delimiting various aspects of consciousness. Okay, so implications of this. First off, this kind of addresses some of the absurdities that we came up with at first, because conventional meaning is precisely both the externalization and the internalization, because it's not just that like we have these concepts that we form individually that we then spit out, but rather that like the totality of consciousness is able to create both external and internal understandings. But this is of an inherently meaningful non-conceptual language. And so for the Shaivas, it is the case that language means something independent of what we would call actual language use in terms of articulate language use in this world. Because that kind of actual language use is a certain kind of delimitation of capacity for meaning and manifestation that's identical with consciousness itself. And so like this gets really into this idea that language is not exhausted by conceptuality, which flips what Yogacarans tend to do with concepts, at least flips what Dharmakirti tends to do with concepts. Yeah. Okay, so a couple of implications for this, and this is where I also want to get into the really interesting analyses of ineffability in Roy's book. So this particular Shaiva take on language gives you a really different kind of ineffable ultimate than the kind that Roy describes. Because this is an ultimate about which everything is said, not just nothing. The reason why the ultimate is not able to be expressed is because it always exceeds any delimited use of words. And so instead of saying no words can touch it, it's that all words are it, and so no individual word or string of words could ever fully encapsulate its infinity. And so we also have the Shaivas very heavily using apophatic techniques, neither one nor many analysis, like looking at polysemy and metaphor, to talk about how any delimited position within the conventional world is not actually going to reach the ultimate. But this shows up differently because of the fact that they see ultimate consciousness as creating and encompassing and exceeding all language use, as opposed to being fundamentally removed from it. Okay, so to make this a little more specific, I want to go into Roy's discussion of the performativity of metaphors for a Sangha. This was another point that I thought was really brilliant, is how rooted this philosophy stayed in its transformative role in Buddhist practice. And I think that's just an essential thing to understand. So Roy talks about how the use of metaphors is not something that's just sort of changing. Oh, I'll just read it. So figures in this picture are no longer viewed as mere content carriers. Instead, by virtue of their referential interchangeability and repetition, they undermine a monosemic world-word correspondence, and in this sense are performative, reflexively invoking and calling to mind a certain understanding of the nature of language, not through any particular content, but by the mere fact of their repeated presence. So this idea here, and this goes back to the example of the magician that Jonardon also brought up, is that if we're looking at the magic show, there's the fact that normal people see it in a way that's illusory, but the magician is able to see it as the materials creating the illusion because he understands the illusion. But what this particular example is doing is also looking at how one set of stuff, the twigs and all the things that the illusion is made out of, can show up in rapid succession as radically different things to an audience. And it's the fact of that rapid transformation that, independent of what it's being transformed into, indicates the polysemy of language. And it's recognizing that rapid transformation that allows an individual to step back and say, wait a second, my whole idea that there's one thing out here that this word is trying to point to, that's wrong because of the way I am seeing this repetition. So Abhinava picks up on this exact same kind of example in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which is just great. So if y'all aren't familiar with it, in the Bhagavad Gita, of course, it's all about Krishna trying to convince Arjuna to go to war. In the sort of climax of it is when Krishna reveals himself in his cosmic form as devouring all of the armies and universes and everything with his mouth and all that. Right before that revelation is the 10th discourse, where Krishna presents himself through a series of what seem to be metaphors. And this discourse is preparing Arjuna to have his entire world kind of blown apart. And the way that Abhinava reads this is amazing. So Krishna gives this series of metaphors where he says things along the lines of, I am discourse among those who speak, the self among all beings, risk among those who cheat, the Himalayas among mountains, Krishna himself among Krishna's own people, and then even Arjuna among the Pandavas. And so when you're reading this, you get caught in that pulsation, that the moving back and forth between all of these different figures is this enactment of the same kind of thing that Roy was pointing to with the magician. And then at the end, Krishna says, I support this entire universe with but a single portion of myself. And so then that, kind of begs the question, so are these actually metaphors? Because remember, if a metaphor is something where the referent is absent in the locus of reference, Krishna's everywhere. So none of these can actually be metaphors. They're all actually literal statements. And Abhinava points this out by saying that this statement, such as I am the self, precludes division. Otherwise, in statements such as among the mountains I am the Himalayas, the Lord would only be the Himalayas and not the other mountains. But so at the same time that these are not just sort of metaphors in the sense of the referent being absent, they're not entirely literal either, because to take them literally to posit an exact identification between the word and its reference would mean that Krishna is just the Himalayas and not everything else. And so the point here is that these are neither exactly metaphorical nor exactly literal, or the point is that metaphor can happen not in relation to an absence only, but in relation to a limit. And I'm going too long, so I'm going to skip ahead very quickly. Oh, no, too far. Okay. So pulling in the Shaivas to all of this brings us to another articulation of the relationship between language, concepts, causality, and reality that kind of sits really interestingly alongside Stiramati's account that Roy describes. And so for a Sangha, we have this idea that what metaphor is doing is like performatively rejecting any ability to express an essential reality, because the ultimate is actually ineffable, and what metaphor does is, like, in a very powerful way, dissolve the kinds of structures that normally hide the ineffable ultimate from us. For Stiramati, and this is luckily the passage that Jonardon also quoted, so kind of what Stiramati adds to this is the idea that what underlies all of this is a real causal nexus. And that under Roy's analysis, you have to have this kind of real causal nexus as the ultimate in order to make it so that this theory is grounded. Like, this is how we get around the Madhyamaka kind of thing. For Abhinava and the Shaivas, these practices of removing duality and looking at the polysemia of language also remove causality, because causality comes about once we have subject-object pairs. But they leave language in place, because language here is the capacity for consciousness to meaningfully experience itself, and so it's a different type of thing, and that's how language can be both eternal and conventional at the same time. Okay.
And I want to thank Bob for inviting me to be part of this, and thank Roy for just a marvelous book that I really learned a lot from, and am still really thinking about quite a bit. The central idea of Roy's book is that all language use is metaphorical. He locates this idea in the thought of Stiramati, and his presentation of the idea, along with his interpretation of Stiramati, are original and important for at least three reasons. First, Roy traces Stiramati's understanding of metaphor and figurative language to Brahminical thinkers, and thereby demonstrates, as a point other people have made already, thereby demonstrates that Buddhist philosophy must be understood as densely interwoven with Brahminical philosophy in the larger South Asian context that Sheldon Pollock calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis. At the same time, Roy downplays schools and systems, Nyaya, Mamamsa, Yogacara, and highlights proper names, Bhartrihari, Helaraja, Punyaraja, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Asanga, and Stiramati. This dual emphasis on the intertextual nature of Indian philosophy and on individual thinkers constitutes an important advance in treating these South Asian materials as philosophy and not just textual artifacts. Second, Roy interprets Stiramati as having both a linguistic theory of metaphor and more broadly, a philosophical theory of meaning. This interpretation brings with it a fresh perspective on Yogacara philosophy, the perspective of the theory of meaning. This perspective can inform the debate about whether Yogacara should be understood as a kind of idealism. For example, consider Vasubandhu's statement at the beginning of his auto-commentary on the Vimshika Karika, the 20 verses, that all phenomena are phenomena of consciousness, Vijnapti Matra, and that the concept of an external referent, artha, outside consciousness is superfluous and unwarranted. Is this a claim of metaphysical idealism, that nothing exists outside of consciousness? Or is it a claim of epistemic idealism, that no knowledge or experience of anything outside of consciousness is possible? And if it is a claim of epistemic idealism, is it a kind of transcendental claim, that consciousness is the condition for the arising of anything that can be experienced or known? Roy largely brackets these questions, so I would like to ask him whether he thinks his reconstruction of Stiramati's theory of meaning can cast new light on these issues about Yogacara and idealism. Obviously, I'm hoping that they can. Third, the claim that all language use is metaphorical or figurative is a significant philosophical thesis, one that we can use to bring Yogacara into conversation with contemporary philosophy. This means doing constructive philosophy here and now, both constructive Buddhist philosophy and constructive cross-cultural philosophy. Roy's book is a welcome example of both. Now, in this short commentary, I can't do justice to the wealth of ideas, analyses, and arguments in the book, so I'm going to limit myself to doing two things. First, I'm going to summarize what I take to be the core ideas of Roy's reading of Stiramati's thesis that all language use is metaphorical. So this is going to involve a bit of repetition of things we've already heard, but hopefully it'll be instructive for people who aren't familiar with the ideas, and it's important in order for the second part of what I want to do, which is to ask whether this thesis, that all language use is metaphorical, can avoid paradox. And I'm going to use this issue to raise a question also about Stier-Matti's critique of Madhyamaka. And all talk of paradox I blame on Bob, who's been talking to me about paradox and now has completely infected my thinking. Okay, so first, the pan-figurative claim. Metaphor is Roy's translation of upacara, a term that could also be translated as figure or figurative designation. The central thesis he explores, which he calls the pan-figurative or pan-metaphorical claim, is that all language use is figurative. Stier-Matti is the source of the idea. In his commentary on Vasubandhu's Trimshika, that we've already seen this quotation, Stier-Matti explains that a word, quote, a word is used figuratively with regard to something which is not there, as when one calls a Bahikan person an ox. Stier-Matti is relying here on Brahminical theories of upacara, according to which figurative designation involves a kind of failure of reference. In figurative use, there is said to be the absence of the primary referent from the locus of reference. For example, in the figurative phrase, the boy is a lion, the primary referent of the word lion is absent from the locus of reference, which is the boy. Stier-Matti's claim, which he presents as an explanation of Vasubandhu's opening verse of the 30 verses, is that in all language use, there is the absence of the primary referent in the locus of reference. Now, before we look at the philosophical basis of this claim, it's important to call attention to how the word metaphor may mislead us here. Metaphor comes from the ancient Greek verb metapherein, which means to transfer. According to Aristotle, a metaphor is the transference of a word from one customary meaning to another new, uncustomary meaning based on some kind of relation between the reference of the words. Later classical thinkers require that this relation be an analogy or a likeness. Thus, to say that the boy is a lion is to transfer the meaning of lion from the animal to the boy by way of a predication or membership statement and based on some kind of analogy or likeness between the two. For example, that both are brave or fierce. In the Indian account of upacara, however, as Roy notes, this is a quotation from Roy, the emphasis is not on the changed meaning of a word, but on the difference in the referential relations between a word and its referent. End quote. The difference in referential relations is that the lion, the primary referent, is absent, whereas the boy, the secondary object that serves as the locus of reference, is present. Given this difference of absence versus presence in the referential relations for lion and boy, respectively, we take the phrase, the boy is a lion, as meaning that they are similar in certain respects. The important upshot is that the pan-figurative claim is not the claim that all language use involves a transference of meaning in the Aristotelian sense. Rather, it's the claim that the purported referent of a term is always absent from the locus of reference. Now, the reasoning behind this claim comes from the Yogacara philosophy, and here we come back to the issues about idealism. The first verse of Vasubandhu's 30 verses states that whenever we use the terms self, atman, or things, dharma, we are speaking metaphorically about what Vasubandhu calls the transformation of consciousness, vijnana parinama. This is the play of the mind that causes the illusion of the self and things to arise. According to Stier-Matti's commentary, self and things are generic terms for all substantive entities. The point appears to be that all of the terms of language are, and can only be, terms for substantive entities, but no such things exist. So, whenever we use language, there is an absence of the primary referent, a mind-independent substantive entity, from the locus of reference. Moreover, the locus of reference is actually the transformation of consciousness and not the outside world, as most people think. In short, since terms are used figuratively when they refer to things that are not there, and the terms of language refer only to the self and things, substantive entities, and the self and things are never there in the manner in which they appear, as mind-independent things, all language is figurative. Now, if we stopped here, we would have just a mind-only variant of the familiar Buddhist idea that the reference of self and things are ultimately unreal, because these terms refer to compound entities, and all compound entities are nominal or conceptual constructions, and hence are not ultimately real. This view makes ordinary language not so much figurative as non-referential. The view is close to what philosophers today call fictionalism. This is the idea that the terms in a given discourse don't have literal reference, but only fictional ones, which may or may not be useful fictions depending on our purposes. So if we just stopped here, we would have a kind of pan-fictionalism. But as Roy explains, that's not Stiramati's view, and it isn't enough for figurative theory of meaning. According to Roy, Stiramati's theory involves a distinction between a term's referent and its sense. He uses these Freudian terms in his explication. The referent of a term is a causal mental process responsible for the appearance of the object to cognition. For example, when we say there is an elephant, we do not refer to a real elephant, rather we refer to a causal mental process that results in an elephant-like appearance. This causal process doesn't involve any mind-independent real elephant. It involves only a causal series of mental events. It follows for this theory that the referent of a term is inscrutable because the karmic causal processes that give rise to any mental appearance are far too complex for anyone, except a Buddha or advanced bodhisattva, to know. Nevertheless, different limited descriptions of that causal process are possible for various beings with their various cognitive capacities. Such descriptions, or such a description, gives us the sense of a term. Hence, one and the same referent can have many different senses. Now, the theory is a figurative theory in the sense that the objects appearing to cognition, the primary reference, are absent from their loci of reference, and the terms that we use to refer to them actually refer to certain experienced qualities, the qualities that belong to or that characterize the mental appearances. So this relates to what Jonardon was talking about with the primary and secondary objects of hallucination. Whereas the advanced bodhisattva understands and directly sees that this is how language works, we ordinary beings do not. So part of what it is to become a bodhisattva is to have, in Roy's words, and this is an example of the eloquence of the book, our awareness be awakened to the metaphorical nature of nearly everything we say, including our most prosaic utterances. Okay, so that's the explication part. So now I want to focus on the question of whether the pan-figurative claim can avoid paradox. The pan-figurative claim implies that the distinction between literal and figurative meaning is groundless. Language is figurative all the way down without ever bottoming out in literal use. But what about the pan-figurative claim itself? Is its meaning literal or figurative? If its meaning is literal, then the pan-figurative claim is false. So its meaning must be figurative. But this implies that the primary referent, language, is absent from the locus of reference, namely the causal series of mental events that is the transformation of consciousness. In other words, language is an illusion, just like the self and things. Nevertheless, I just used language to say this. Maybe this is like my saying in a dream, "This is a dream." After all, I'm not really saying this is a dream. I'm dreaming that I'm saying it. Nevertheless, what I dream that I'm saying is true. This analogy seems reminiscent of the familiar Buddhist idea of creating an illusion in a magic show to have an effect on another illusion. I have an effect on the illusion of the dream by effecting another illusion, namely the illusion of saying this is a dream. It's an illusion because I'm only dreaming that I'm saying this. But the obvious retort in this case of the dream analogy is that I'm not dreaming that there is a language, I'm dreaming in a language. In which case, language doesn't have an entirely illusory status, as it apparently does according to the Yogacara pan-figurative claim. Rather, language exists outside the dream and bridges between the dreaming and the waking states. Moreover, if we say that language is an illusion, we're back to the same problem. Does that statement have literal or figurative meaning? If its meaning is literal, then the pan-figurative claim is false. And if its meaning is figurative, then we have not said what we were trying to say. In short, we seem to have arrived at an expressibility paradox of saying the unsayable, namely that all language is figurative. Now, the expressibility paradox arises in Roy's discussion of Asanga, but not as far as I can see in his discussion of Stiramati. Roy analyzes a passage in which Asanga replies to the objection that to assert this is a quotation from Roy describing the objection, that to assert the inexpressibility of reality itself expresses this reality in a minimal way, resulting in a performative contradiction, because the thing described as inexpressible cannot by definition be the referent of any language usage. Asanga answers, quote, "To this we reply that there is no fallacy here, since at the moment of stating that something inexpressible is inexpressible, the expressibility of that very statement has already been refuted." End quote. Roy's explanation of this statement is that, quote, "The claim that the essential nature is inexpressible is intentionally self-refuting, and its self-refutation is part of an all-encompassing refutation of every and any attempt to express reality." A bit later, Roy writes that, quote, "What the opponent sees as contradictory, and hence incoherent, serves as a true limit contradiction in the hands of Asanga." End quote. The term true limit contradiction raises the question of whether Roy is reading Asanga as a dialetheist, that is, as endorsing true contradictions expressed by paradoxes of totality at the limits of thought. So I would like to ask Roy whether he thinks Asanga, or Yogacara more generally, if we can speak that way, entails dialetheism. Does he think that the expressibility paradox that occurs in asserting the inexpressibility of reality implies a true contradiction? Consider that it's one thing to say that language is performatively self-negating, that it can, via certain arguments and paradoxical statements, delineate its own limits and evoke the ineffable. It's another thing to say that in doing so, language is revealing true contradictions, especially if the true contradictions are supposed to be ontological ones, ones that belong to the being of the things themselves. This stronger claim does not seem to sit well with the general Yogacara attitude toward language, which is that, as Roy says, language does not truly represent reality in any respect. But of course, that statement also generates an expressibility paradox. These questions matter not just for interpreting Yogacara, but also for evaluating Stiramati's arguments against Madhyamaka. Stiramati makes a threefold analogy or parallelism between metaphor, the transformation of consciousness, and convention. So first of all, a linguistic metaphor, he says, requires a support, which is the locus of reference. The boy in the statement, the boy is a lion. Secondly, self and things require the transformation of consciousness. Self and thing as metaphors are absent from the locus of reference and should be regarded as actually being the transformation of consciousness. And then three, convention requires a basis, he says. Madhyamaka philosophers assert that all phenomena are conventional, but the problem with such conventionalism, according to Stiramati, is not just that conventional or nominal phenomena require an extra-conventional or extra-nominal support, a claim that a Madhyamaka will not accept, but also that language requires extra-linguistic underlying conditions as its support for it to be meaningful. So Stiramati argues Madhyamaka conventionalism, if it's understood to mean that there are no extra-linguistic conditions, makes meaningful discourse impossible, and hence is senseless. In short, Stiramati's claim is that the Madhyamaka view of language is self-undermining. For Yogacara, however, or for Stiramati, the required extra-linguistic conditions of language are the transformation of consciousness, the dependent nature, which is also the support for convention and the locus of reference for the metaphor of self and things. Roy seems to accept Stiramati's argument against Madhyamaka. He says, this is a quotation, Stiramati's figurative theory of meaning escapes this problem of being self-undermining, and that it also successfully upholds the meaningfulness of the school's own metaphysical discourse, whereas Madhyamaka, by implication, isn't able to uphold the meaningfulness of its own discourse. But I'm not convinced. If the pan-figurative claim entails an expressibility paradox, then it's hard to see why Yogacara is more successful, or for that matter, less successful, than Madhyamaka. After all, terms such as support, locus of reference, basis of convention, extra-linguistic conditions, transformation of consciousness, and dependent nature are themselves figurative. They are metaphors, according to the pan-figurative thesis. This pan-figurative state of affairs seems to be on all fours with the Madhyamaka claim that all phenomena are conventional. So I don't see how Stiramati's pan-figurative viewpoint is philosophically more or less successful than Madhyamaka's pan-conventionalism. To end, I'm eager to hear what Roy has to say about these issues. So I will summarize them as the following questions. Does the pan-figurative claim entail an expressibility paradox? Does the pan-figurative claim entail a true contradiction? Is it dialetheist? And why should we think that the Yogacara pan-figurative claim fares any better or any worse than the Madhyamaka pan-conventional claim? Thank you.
Thank you. All of you. I mean, the problem of having such great speakers is that they actually read the book very closely, extremely closely, and are asking very tough questions. Which, I mean, the book is done, but it appears that I have to rethink about a few things. So, okay, I'll try to answer shortly, okay, briefly, and generally. I'll evade the questions that I don't have answers to, and I'll try also to refer to your questions together. But I'll begin with Jonardon. About the issue is, so if I got you right, you're asking about in what sense is the self the same in terms of objectivity conditions for meaning, or in what way are they speaking about the same thing if they're completely referring to different aspects of that same phenomena. And in a way, I was asked before that from the audience a question whether the Buddha's voice is real, and I kind of stuttered and went on. And actually, this is the kind of the question I would need to ask, because what you're asking, if I understand you correctly, and correct me if I'm not, you're asking what is real, or what is kind of can serve as a shared basis for meaning. That we say that we're not just engaging in parallel play, for instance, but in intersubjectivity when we use language. And I think that, and if that is the question, I think that the Yogacara gives that up. It's not interested in any conditions, objective conditions for meaning, in the sense that actually what determines meaning is pragmatics. I mean, pragmatist consideration. So basically, the Bodhisattva, and I'll give an example, I deal with that in the book. One of the weird questions that engage the Yogacara is what happens when the Bodhisattva reaches non-conceptual knowledge. That means the annihilation of phenomena. Because if phenomena is constructed through vikalpa, through discursive thoughts, and once one gets rid of that, even that entails the disappearance of phenomena. And then they answer that the world, the bhajana loka, is maintained by the vikalpa of others. So in that sense, the Bodhisattva is a kind of a guest. He ferries in a world that is not his own creation, but then he operates within that world. So that world is a constructed realm, and it's a constructed realm for the ordinary people there and for the Bodhisattva as well. And what enables the shared meaning is karma, is a reduction to causal streams in that sense. And when you ask, so if we think about the dagger and the sensory qualities of the dagger, in that sense, in what sense they constitute a dagger that we can talk about. So I would think that the Bodhisattva traces that to the Yogacara traces that to the upaya of the Bodhisattva. his ability to use the dagger in a way that is comprehensible to the persons there, and by no other criteria. So you would not really, you cannot say that they are, maybe well, it's too late now, but they're not speaking about the same thing, as there is no convergence of meaning, there's just a convergence of successful activity in that sense. So objects are just the things that work for us, and that creates their meaning for the bodhisattva and the ordinary person. Have I responded? Yeah, okay. And then I moved to Kat's. Kat was nice. She didn't ask me any tough questions, but actually, but her account really presents the most tough question of all, because it's saying that maybe this whole Yogacara thing is arbitrary, right? Because she shows the exact kind of the same approach, but the mirror image of the Yogacara approach, in a way that you start with. You also can start with polysemy and then deduce from that not the absence of real entities, but actually a fullness of language in that sense. I have no attachment for the Yogacara. I mean, in a way, I kind of like the Shaivite as well. But I would ask, I mean, it's clear to me what Bhartrhari wants to achieve out of that, because Bhartrhari is a grammarian and he's deeply interested in language. But then how can you kind of defend the stance, How can it be coherent for Abhinavagupta in arguing, why have this argument about language? Why not just plainly argue about ontology? In a way, right? Because it seems that it's an ontological argument that is being retranslated constantly into linguistic terms and conceptual terms. So is it kind of a traditional, what it takes from Bhartrhari, or is it something that I wonder about that. But yeah, I think that it's kind of, it could be the Yogacara, could be, the title of the essay could be "Roads Not Taken by the Mimamsa," in a way, in that sense. They're obsessed, and this was what was interesting for me. I didn't expect to find that, but I saw that they're really interested with the issue of polysemy. For instance, polysemy is something that is fascinating for them, because it's a kind of, you have multiplicity of meaning, and then you solve it by the Buddhists as going to a model that assumes that there are no real reference for words, or like for the Mimamsa, that actually you stick onto an ontological account of language. And they're very close in that sense. You can go back also to Jonardon, but I'll be brief so you can also talk. And then I'll reply to, did I address all the points that were you asking me? Yeah, specific, yeah. Okay. And for Evan questions, well, I think I made a pretty good excuse in the book why I shouldn't delve into the idealist thing, and it worked, although it was a little bit of an excuse, because I would say that first there is the historical, textual reason in that sense. And in that sense, I would say that a Sangha is not Stiramati, in the sense that they do not, although they are both called early Yogacara, they do not represent the same kind of attitudes towards language. So they would give a different, I think, answers to your questions. So for a Sangha, there is an inexpressibility paradox, as you pointed out, and there is also, I think, that he would take the existence of true contradictions in that sense. But for a Sangha, you don't see the kind of pan-figurative account of that you see in Sthiromati, and there is something inexplicable there in the way that language and reality connects. Because for Sangha, the ineffable is the vastu, is like an ontological reality that cannot be explained or described, and somehow, in some way, it's a little bit Kantian in that sense. On top of that, you have the kalpa, and you have this kind of, the phenomenal world is being constructed. And there's no explanation of how Upacāra uses that term, actually refers to that ontological basis. And so we would have the inexpressibility paradox, but of course he would kind of crumble facing a Madhyamika attack on that argument, I think. For Sthiromati, that's kind of let me think. I'll begin with the last question. I don't think that Sthiromati gives a better argument than the Madhyamika. I mean, this was not my intention, and maybe I should have made it more clear. What I mean to say, I think that the Madhyamika rules, basically, in the sense that there's no way of really dealing with its argument in respect to language. But they're kind of, for Sthiromati, they're losing, they're winning the fight, but they're losing the war in a way. Because their argument on the status of language does not, for Sthiromati, allows for the authority of scripture. So in that sense, the Yogacara, in that sense I meant that the Yogacara, that their argument is more successful. It's successful in the limited sense of taking care of their interests. And their interest is that even if all discourse is conventional, and in that sense they're operating under the Prajna Paramita paradigm that the Madhyamika is also operating, still they want to maintain that some claims are more meaningful than others for upholding the authority of scripture, which the Madhyamika would say, is not really important in that sense, in the sense that the Yogacara. So in that sense, they're more successful. I don't know what to do with the paradox of inexpressibility with Sthiromati. I really don't know how to respond to that. Yeah, I might have a way, but it's a trick. But it's not my trick, it's the Yogacara trick. It's called the three natures. Right? It's a kind of an excuse not to really commit to an ontological clear metaphysics, because Sthiromati, and this is something that is really confusing. Sthiromati, the way I see it, has an ontological commitment. There is reality exists, and that reality is suchness, and it's ineffable, and it's not clear if it's mine or not mine, because at the end you have to abandon both object and subject duality, and also the notion of mind only, right, as the model to look at, to view reality. So it's ineffable, but then when any kind of discourse or way to describe it, you fall back, and that's the parinishpana, the perfected. But any attempt to describe it has to be done from the perspective of the dependent. And even the bodhisattva, and that's kind of surprising, is not someone that dwells on the perfected in the nirvikalpa jnana, in non-conceptual knowledge, but actually operates mostly with knowledge of causality, which is conceptual, but not the ordinary conceptual way, under a knowledge of the dependent. So you would say, what is this, the ultimate status of the claim that all language is is figurative? So we would say, of course, it's conventional. It's not. It's itself figurative in a way. But then you say, then it doesn't exist. Then we move back to the dependent, and we say, well, what we mean is actually the causal underlying nexus that explains it. And then you say, then causality is real, and you say, no, reality is real. Suchness is real. Causality is from the view of the dependent. So it's a kind of a dialectical move. And that's a vulnerability of the Yogacara as a philosophical system. But especially in respect to the Madhyamika. So the Yogacara lose in philosophical arguments, but for them they win the Buddhist the war in a sense, because they uphold scripture, because they have a system of metaphysics, and they can speak about meditation, for instance. Yeah, okay.
I'm going to use my position as moderator to try to do something that pulls the whole thing together, and we'll see if it works. I was interested. So Jonardon is using Mark Johnson to make a distinction. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but the distinction seems to be between the perceptual object and the perception of said object in the case of a hallucination, which struck me immediately as kind of nuts. And you yourself seem to concede that it's nuts. When you say it's immune to error, this just seems to rehearse Dennett's quine qualia argument against qualia. That you really can't, that particular distinction, the fact that you can't actually disaggregate those two tells you there's something wrong with the distinction itself. And this made me think that what the real problem for the Buddhists is the fundamental distinction between vikalpa and nirvikalpa. As soon as you make that distinction, you're who knows where you're going, but because it raises the question of, is that distinction itself ultimate or not? And this is the question, this seems to tie in with kind of Evan's point that there's a fundamental paradox here you can't get out of. And then what's interesting with Kat, but also in Roy's book, it gives you, suddenly you see the Mimamsa and the Shaivas in a much more positive light, because both of them see that you can't step out of language. There's something fundamental about language. And the whole notion of nirvikalpa then is an attempt to step somewhere where there's no place to step. So I just want to kind of throw that out as a way to pull it together. And I don't know, do you want to make some very quick responses to Roy? Should we just open it? We have 15 minutes left. Maybe we should just open it up. Questions? Comments?
Yeah, so jumping in really quickly from the Shaivas, and I'm 90% sure they get this from Bhartrihari. The entire sort of paradigm of language is based on looking at the action of a verb and figuring out what the different factors are that go into creating that action. And so the sort of elements that you're looking at are going to be the different things that are denoted by the different cases in Sanskrit grammar, but everything that that's doing is actually taking a verb and like unraveling it. And so the nouns are actually secondary to the verbs. But I can see what you're saying in terms of then like we end up looking at the various pieces that have been like pulled out of the motion of the verb.
Defending Roy against two of the points, one that Evan made and one that Jonardon made, in the sense of offering a tool, not specifically from Buddhist philosophy, that I think can be useful. So in the first case, where the objection is that we might ask, what's the common object when we talk about self, and we're having the Buddha and a person who isn't unenlightened talking about the self? That was the question, I thought, one of them. Well, one thing that I think you can say when you look, maybe it can be found in Buddhist studies, but outside of that, there's the idea that sometimes the common object is just a non-ordinary object. And if we're looking for an ordinary object in this case, we are sort of deluded because we're not going to find an ordinary object. But the non-ordinary object in this case could be quite clear. It's the thing that has the error space of being confused by one person but not confused by the other. I mean, I know that's a weird construction, but it's a non-ordinary object. And insofar as many philosophers now explore the idea of non-ordinary objects, we can say that there is a common object that's being discussed. It's the thing that has exactly this error space between the person on one side and the person on the other.
That's a Poha, basically.
That's a what?
That's a Poha.
Yeah, but is that an exclusion?
So,
Poha is exclusion, so would that be correctly termed?
well, the way that you can get the exclusion for Napoha is because of the inherent difference of all things from everything else. And
Okay.
so it's because of the fact that everything is equally different, they can be divided up in an infinite number of ways.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's how you get there. Like the
Okay.
capacity for things to be erroneously viewed in a whole bunch of different ways is the reason why you can then have their goals and habits and all that kind and desires forming a certain type of error about it.
Oh, okay, insightful. I learned something about a Poha. Okay, maybe, so right, so I'm just using a trick like from thinking about non-ordinary objects and finding a denotation. Okay, so if that worked with the Poha, then that sounds like at least one thing we can say there. And then, on the other hand, concerning this issue about the paradox, and so I just want to make sure I understood. So is the paradox that if we take the sentence, everything is fictional, the paradox is generated because we're talking about that sentence itself describing things correctly. Is that correct?
The paradox is when we say all language is figurative.
Right, all language
is
is
that
figurative.
statement figurative or not?
Right, so I think, so one of the strategies that we oftentimes take is to go dialectus to make sense of it. But there's another common strategy that can get currency here also, and I also don't know what it might be found in the Buddhist tradition. But there's a technique of quantifier domain restriction, which is amply findable in natural language. Most of the time when we are using quantifiers, it seems like we're tacitly restricting the domain. If I say at this conference, it seems like everybody's into Stiramati, I'm clearly not referring to everyone in the world. I'm referring to all the Buddhist scholars who seem to be talking about Stiramati, right? So it seems like we tacitly use all and no and some with domain restrictions. And so one way to try to get out of this paradox is to say, well, the sentence, everything is figurative, is actually restricted from being in the domain of what we're talking about. I don't know how much that helps or how much Buddhist...
I don't think that'll work because
Right.
the statement is meant to be a totality statement, so it's
Right.
meant to have, scope, universal scope over everything, and the paradox arises as a totality paradox.
So they really they want the claim to be,
I think so.
they intend it to be total. Okay,
Yeah, I think
okay,
so.
so can't go that way then. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is directed mainly to Professor Ganeri. Two things. One, you presented this possibility of translating Upacāra as superimposition or projection, which I thought is problematic because part of the problem in Indian philosophy is we have too many terms we're translating as superimposition or projection. So I think the movement should be to find other terms to kind of enrich this kind of discussion. And Upacāra, particularly because it pertains to language, I felt like metaphor is a more appealing translation. So that's one comment. But I have more of a question about the pan-literalist claim you made as opposed to the pan-figurative one. So it seems, I really like it. I kind of want to buy into it. But it seems that if any kind of arrangement that is similar to an ox, we can call it an ox, right? If it's a toy, if it's a picture of an ox. But what happens if we want to refer to a foreigner or someone like the Bhalika example who doesn't, the arrangement, he doesn't look like an ox in any kind of way, and we're calling him an ox, this has to be a metaphor. This can't be literal as I see it, because the arrangement isn't there. It doesn't look like an ox. It doesn't have the figure of an ox, but we're calling it an ox. So how can the pan-literalist position kind of include this kind of use of language?
EP standing up.
What? But can an oxygen stand? That's a shared quality. It's not an arrangement, I think. But.
No, he was supposed to. He did resemble an ox in terms of having
No,
his hair
your
standing up in
example
like
of
torn shapes and...
the example of the wrestler kind of
Yeah.
solved that problem. But not every person looks like that particular wrestler. So that's the...
I think what your question does very interestingly introduces the whole topic of vagueness, though.
Yeah,
There's no kind of sharp
definitely.
boundary about how much resemblance has to be in place or how
Yeah,
many
I agree.
structural properties have to be instantiated for the term to get a grip. There's like a continuum, and there's no kind of sharp boundary point.
Thank you.
Anything else on the panel? What, am I missing somebody?
Yeah, looks like there's a question.
Go for it.
So, I don't remember the exact philosopher that you guys mentioned said this, or which school it was, but regarding the paradox of language and how it is all figurative, and like the statement that language itself is figurative is in a sense figurative. I was thinking of how that relates to the Buddhist teachings, and I was wondering, so when the slide was brought up of the river, and how an enlightened bodhisattva or the Buddha would see the river not as a essential, like discrete object of a river, but could see past that language, figurative language barrier. Would the philosophy that asserts this language paradox support, do you think, or refute the claim that the Buddha's teachings are not truly the Buddha's teachings, because the Buddha would be able to see in his own state not bound by language, but yet has to somehow communicate that with others via language. So how would that kind of tie into this language paradox, and would that allow for the Buddha to truly communicate what he finds or what he believes with others?
If I get the question right, I mean, the thought that comes to mind is actually something that Roy mentioned, which is the work that Jonardon did on this idea of the thoughtless Buddha. So the Buddha appears to be thinking, appears to be speaking in language, but really there's no thought, there's no intention, there's no linguistic intention, there's no production of speech. There's just this spontaneous, or you might say automatic response that's completely appropriate to the particular situation that listener happens to be in. So that's how they would get around that issue.
Okay.
In effect, making the Buddha mindless. I mean, that would be one way to put it.
If I can jump in, and that's the problem of the Yogacara with this kind of paradox, because by implication it presupposes, this kind of, you cannot really give any kind of a positive account of the Buddha or of your, all you can do with language is kind of, language can show its own limits and kind of deconstruct it, so, and then you're left out with it's kind of an empty description of the Buddha, and the Yogacara does not want to do that. I would think still that they would respond to this kind of, they would turn Madhyamika, confronted with this kind of paradox. So they would answer like Nagarjuna, it's just an artificial person. So, and if pressed to the wall and saying, well, what about your own use of language, they would say it's conventional, it's all conventional, but within convention there are different degrees of meaning, but this is also conventional.
So thank you. One more.
Real quick, are the Shaivas dealing with anicca in the same way that the Buddhist philosophical tradition has to deal with impermanence?
So,
And is that one of the,
yeah,
just in terms
yeah.
of DNA, that you're dealing with two different DNAs, or sort of a different sort of code within the DNA that has to be held in?
So there's, I forget exactly who told, but another scholar, David Tomlinson, who works on like late Yogacara Buddhists and does some stuff with Shaivas, made a comment to me once that some Shaiva wrote that if the Yogacharans would just say that the Paratantra is Shiva, then they'd have everything right. So they are absolutely in that same world where the idea of both permanence and permanence are relative constructions. So by the time you're getting to the ultimate level, neither one of those apply whatsoever. So Shiva is no more permanent than he is impermanent.
And of course, that's exactly what the Tathagata Garba
Yes,
and
and
Buddha
that's
nature
exactly,
people do.
yeah.
And does the Yogacara have that same position that it just falls away, the impermanence just falls away, or is
I mean, to the extent that it's constructed as a duality, it does. But then I think this also gets at the like Madhyamaka Yogacara. How far are the Yogacharans really going to go?
Yeah. So you would say, yeah, definitely, because all duality is just a vikalpa, and at the end there is no vikalpa. But then you want to account for the bodhisattva activity, so you go again to the dependent, and then you have these notions. They're conventional, but they're useful. So they're both holding to that ineffable reality, but also to the Buddhist conventional way of operating in the world. So impermanence is useful.
In fact, one more quick question.
Can you give a linguistic example of the inexpressibility paradox?
Reality is inexpressible. I just expressed that it was inexpressible.
And on that wonderful note.